Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. I'm Elana Stein Hain, and we are here to conceptualize halakha on the basis of the Gemara in the daf that week. So this week, we continued on our march in Bava Metzia, and we may have noticed that on daf Hey Amud Bet, the Gemara talks about that strange din from the first mishnah, not the yachloku part, that you split the garment or the value of the garment, but the bishvua part, using an oath. Now, I want to think for a second about what the role of an oath, of a shvuah, is. Because once you say that people should split something, isn't that enough? Meaning, we've decided that this is the ruling. Why does anybody need to take a shvuah? And for that reason, I'd like to actually spend some time talking about what we call shvuat dayanim, the shvuot that are court mandated in situations of contested possessions or money. Not all, but many. We will notice that on daf Hey Amud Bet, where the Gemara says, well, what's the deal with this shvuah? Rabbi Yochanan says this shvuah is actually for a very particular purpose. It is meant to be a deterrent from people who will go and just grab each other's stuff in the street and say, give me half of it because half of it is mine. Right? The fact that Rabbi Yochanan says that that's the reason for it, he seems to be suggesting that the other reasons we might think for these shvuah are not applicable. And what I mean by the other reasons shvuah might apply is there are already two major categories of shvuot dayanin that exist in the Mishnah. Right? If you look at the Mishnah in Shevuot, you will see that there's a general d'oraita category of shvuat dayanin, and there is a general category of d'rabbanan shvuot dayanin called shvuat HaMishnah. And it seems like by Rabbi Yochanan saying this is a special shvuah that is it decreed in order to keep people from taking each other's stuff, it seems like it doesn't fit into either of those paradigms. So the minute I hear that something doesn't fit into the major paradigms, I say to myself, well, wouldn't it be interesting and important for us to immerse ourselves a little bit in the world of Shevuot in order to understand what those general paradigms are? So at least in the Mishnah, you have the category of d'oraita, Shevuot dayanin, where the court is going to mandate someone to take a shvuah, where there's a claim of money and the other one disagrees with the claim. And you have a d'rabbanan form of shvuat dayanin, again called Shevuot HaMishnah, which you'll find in the 7th parak of the Mishnah in Masachet Shevuot. Now, the difference between the d'oraita category and the d'rabbanan category is that in the d'oraita category, the one who takes the shvuah is the defendant. The defendant takes a shvuah and doesn't have to pay what is being claimed of them. Called nishba v'niftar, or nishbat v'nifteret. In the d'rabbanan category of Shevuot HaMishnah, again, 7th parak of Shevuot, it's actually the reverse. It's the plaintiff who takes a shvuah. And by taking the shvuah, the plaintiff actually is allowed to take the money that they're claiming, meaning they get paid. Called nishba'at v'notelet, or nishba v'notel. Someone who takes a shvuah and literally takes money. And in both of these situations, or in both of these big categories of shvuat dayanin d'oraita and shvuat HaMishnah d'rabbanan, regardless of whether we're ruling for the defendant, as in shvuat, the shvuot d'oraita, where we say the defendant takes a shvuah and doesn't have to pay, or whether we're ruling for the plaintiff in the cases of shvuot d'rabbanan, where we say that the plaintiff takes a shvuah and takes their money, it seems that the role of a shvuah is to kind of inject a bit of seriousness or deterrent in the process of ruling in someone's favor, right? We're going to rule in your favor, defendant, but we want to make sure that, we want to make sure that you're telling the truth. So we're going to tell you that you have to take a Shevuot, which is going to be on a Sefer Torah or on tefillin. It's a very serious thing. And thus, we're kind of deterring you from lying and also telling the plaintiff, look, like we're very serious about this. We're very serious about this. And the same thing where we have a Shevuah for the plaintiff to take. We're ruling for the plaintiff, but we're basically saying to the defendant, know that we're being really serious about this, right? We're not just letting the plaintiff take the money. We're making the plaintiff take a Shevuah in order to make sure the plaintiff doesn't lie or to give some disincentive from lying, right? So Shevuah plays a really interesting role here, right? Like, I don't know that it's evidentiary. Some people talk about it as evidentiary, but I kind of look at it as mostly deterrent, I guess, right? Or, the flip side, like strengthening a person's claim because they're willing to take a Shevuah, right? The question of how much does it clarify? I think it's a fair question, right? Meaning like Eidim clarify things. Does a Shevuah clarify things or does a Shevuah, make a person's claim stronger because they're willing to, swear on a Sefer Torah, right? So it's just something interesting to think about the role that a Shevuah plays versus the role that Eidim play, for example. So let's take a look at Shevuot HaDayanin D'Oraita and Shevuot HaMishnah, meaning the Shevuot HaDayanin D'Rabbanan. Okay? Sharing my screen. Okay. So first things first, the pasuk in the Torah that gives us our general binyan av, our general principle that the Shevuot that are D'Oraita are for the defendant and they're nishba v'niftar, that the defendant takes a Shevuah and doesn't have to pay. Shmot kafbet pasuk yud. We're talking about a situation where I gave something to a person to watch for me, and they had it on their property, and something happened to it, right? And I basically say, look, you had it on your property. You obviously did something wrong here. And the Torah says, Shevuat Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem. There's going to be a Shevuah between the two of them. Im lo shalach yado b'melechet re'eh. What's the content of that Shevuah? The content of that Shevuah is, I didn't touch your stuff, right? Okay, who's going to make that Shevuah? I didn't touch your stuff. Presumably the defendant, right? And then v'lakach be'alav. Now, v'lakach be'alav is strange language, right? Because the owners are not going to take anything, right? So v'lakach be'alav is actually translated as the owner of the object, plaintiff, is just going to have to acquiesce. Like they're just going to have to accept the fact that this is the situation. V'lo yeshalim. And the defendant is not going to pay. And the Gemara in Shevuot, Daf Mem Hey says, right? All of those Shevuot that people take that are min haTorah are Shevuot of nishba v'niftar, right? You take the Shevuot and you don't have to pay as the defendant. Minalan, how do we know? Like from where do we derive it? Tamar Kra, the pasuk says, v'lakach be'alav v'lo yishalim, right? And the Baalim have to accept the situation, and the defendant is not going to pay. Misha alav l'shalim, the one who would have had to pay, lo shvuah. That's the one who has to take the shvuah, right? So this becomes binyanav archetype for our shvuot deoraita. Now the examples of shvuot deoraita are three. One is moda b'miktzah tatana, right? And you're familiar with that one already, which is you say I owe you 100 zuz. I say I owe you 50 zuz. The other 50, I take Shevuah and I don't have to pay, right? Fine. There's lots of interesting things, lots of interesting requirements for Moda B'Miktzah Tatana. But suffice it to say, the Shevuah D'Oraita, and I'm taking a Shevuah on the stuff that I say that I don't owe and that I don't have to pay. A second, Shevuah HaShomrim, the Shevuah of those who are watching things or borrowing things, as the case may be. Well, really, the best examples are watching things really, watching things for free or watching things for pay. But I'm watching something for you. Let's say I'm a shomeret chinam. I'm watching something for free for you. So something happens to it. I'm going to take a shvuah that shelo pashati. I didn't do anything negligent to cause this bad stuff to happen. And then I'm not going to have to pay you anything. I'm not going to have to compensate you. And then the third example, really interesting, is where I'm in a situation and actually the other person should have to take the shvuah, right? And, oh, excuse me, I messed that up. I misspoke. That's for later. Sorry. Eid echad me'id kenegdo is a situation where I'm a litigant in a case with someone else, and that person, the plaintiff, they bring one witness, not two witnesses, which would help them win the case, right? Hamotzi mechaver lavaraya, someone who's trying to get money from someone else. They need a raya, they need evidence, which in this case would be two witnesses, but they only have one witness. In that situation, I have to take a shvuah, right? We don't just ignore the fact that they have one witness, right? Their one witness makes somewhat of a difference. So that's our general nishba v'niftar, nishbat v'nifteret, shvuot hadayanin d'oraita. What about d'Rabbanan? What are the kinds of cases that we're looking at? So the mishnah in Shevuot, Perek Zayin, starts with kol nishbiin shepatur nishbiin v'lo mishalmim, something we already know. Every shvuah that people take that's a shvuah d'oraita, they take a shvuah and they don't pay, right? That's the defendant. But ve'elu, but these following shvuot d'Rabbanan, nishbain v'notlin. They take a shvuah and they take money. And these are cases where we are talking about a plaintiff, right? They take a shvuah and they get money. And here are the examples. Hasachir, somebody who is a laborer, meaning an employee. Hanigzal, someone who's had something stolen from them. It's a very particular case. If you continue in the mishnah, there you'll see it. Vanechbal, somebody who was bodily injured. Vishekinegdo, chashur al shvuah. This is the mistake that I made before. Somebody who actually the other litigant should be taking a shvuah, but that person is known to be a liar in matters of Shevuot, so they're not allowed to take a Shevuot. So now I get to take the Shevuot as the plaintiff and take my money. Excuse me, and a store owner with their, their record of their, what do we say, their ledger, I guess, of who owes them money. So an example, I'll give one of the examples because each one of these has its own sort of has its own explanation as to why, first of all, in those situations, the plaintiff gets to take their money. And then why, if they get to take their money, do they have to take a shvuah, right? Meaning, because those are two different pieces, right? When you say they get to be notel, they get to take their money, it sounds like, oh, we totally side with them. When we say they have to be nishba, you're basically saying, well, we want to make sure, right? We want to make sure that they're willing to take a shvuah on this. We want to make sure this is sort of like our way of communicating how serious this is, so that nobody will lie. So one example, the nechbal example, I think is particularly interesting because the situation is somebody walked into somebody else's, right? This is the way the Mishnah tells it. You have to look at the Gemara to see more and more and more. But the way the Mishnah tells it, a plaintiff walks into a defendant's house or into a place with the defendant, and Adam saw them walk in and saw that the plaintiff was totally fine, right? Like bodily fine. And then they walk out and it's clear that the defendant, or it's clear that let's do this again, right? Maybe I'll ask Maggie to take this out. This is the foibles of doing this at the end of the day. It goes as follows. Plaintiff and defendant walk in somewhere. Two Adam saw the defendant walk in, Plaintiff and defendant walk in somewhere. Two Adam see the plaintiff walking in, see that the plaintiff is totally bodily uninjured, right? Shalem or shlema. Then the plaintiff walks out and is clearly injured, right? So the Adam didn't see what happened inside, but you can reasonably presume that the defendant did something to them, right? So in that situation, and of course the Gemara goes into, is it possible you have to have a situation where it's not something that the Nechbal could have done to themselves, et cetera, et cetera. But in that situation, it's a weird case because like you have Edim who see something, but they don't see the actual injury that happens. So we say if the Nechbal is willing to take a Shevuah, the Nechbal can get their compensation. And I think it's a really interesting example because one of the things we talk about, like in the 21st century, when people are hurt, are we going to be victim centric? This is actually quite victim centric in an interesting kind of way, right? We rule for the Nechbal. It's true that we make them take a Shevuah, but we do rule for the Nechbal ultimately, right? So that's the example of Shevuat HaMishnah, right? Also, Sefer Torah or Tefillin. Now, there is another big category of Shevuot that did not exist in the time of the Mishnah. It wouldn't fall under either of the headings that we described before. And I just think it's important to know about because if we are, immersing ourselves in the world of these types of Shevuot, it's worth understanding that there was a point at which it seemed that the Shevuot that they had at their disposal weren't actually applying to all the cases where they needed Shevuot, right? And this is not the only example of a Shevuah that doesn't fit into the above two categories. There are certain places even earlier, even in the time of the Mishnah that you'll see, but the two that we gave you are sort of the biggest categories. But the Gemara in Shevuot and Daf Mem Bet describes a specifically Amoraic category of Shevuah, right? Manel biyadcha ein lecha biyadi pater, right? So the situation is we have a plaintiff who says, you have 100 zuz of mine, and we have a defendant who is what we call kofer bakol or koferet bakol. They say, nope, I have zero, right? They don't say I have some. I have zero. It's not modib b'miktzat. I have nothing. So min Torah, they're exempt from paying because guess what? You want to take money out of my hand? Bring some edim. If you don't have edim, you don't get anything, right? But Rav Nachman says, I still want the defendant to take a shvuah. Amar Rav Nachman, umashbi'ina to shvuat hesed. But Rav Nachman says, we're going to make the defendant take somebody who's koferet bakol or kofer bakol. We're going to make them take a shvuat hesed. We're going to make them take, some people say it's like a shvuah of inducement, like lahasit, but I'm a little confused by the terminology. A lot of people try to explain the word hesed, maybe that you're pushing someone to do the shvuah, but it usually has the understanding of enticement. So I'll admit that philologically, I don't yet understand, but that's my own maybe lack of research. I don't yet understand why the word hesed is used here. But the point is, we're going to make that person take a shvuah, and it's weird because remember we said shvuah to oraita are supposed to be the nishba v'niftar, right? That the defendant takes a shvuah and doesn't have to pay. And here, shvuat hesed is going to be, it's a dirabanan shvuah, it's a takana, and it's also going to be nishba v'niftar. You're not going to make the defendant pay, right? Because minator, they don't have to pay. It's only this takana dirabanan that we're making them take a shvuah, right? So my timer, why are we making them take a shvuah? Chazaka ein adam tovea elim kein yesh lo alav. This is really interesting. We have a presumption that people don't make a claim unless there's some validity to it. Whoa, that's a really big presumption, right? Like that kind of changed a lot of things. People only make presumptions. They only make a claim. A plaintiff only makes a claim if there's some validity to it. And the Gemara immediately says, what? The claimant only makes a claim. The plaintiff only makes a claim if there's validity to it. What about the fact that, this defendant said, I owe you nothing? Who is that chutzpahdik? We have another presumption. Nobody would be that chutzpahdik to say to somebody who lent them money, I owe you $0, right? It says, Adarab, it's the opposite. A person is not, so brazen that they would say, I owe you $0. So why are you making them take a shvuat hesed? If they say, I owe you $0, we believe them because human nature, you're not going to look the person who gave you money in the face and say, I owe you nothing, right? Somebody who lent you money, right? So the Gemara says, nah. There might be a reason to look somebody in the face who lent you money and say $0. Not because you're being brazen, but ishtamutehu kitam ishtami lay. You're buying time, essentially. You're basically saying, when I make enough money, when I have enough money, I'll go back and pay him. But for right now, I'm kind of avoiding it. So I'm basically saying, I owe you no money. I owe you no money. So we're back to the assumption that in Adam Tovea, Elim Ken Yishlo, a plaintiff doesn't make a claim unless there's some validity to it. And I think that's really interesting to the extent that Rav Nachman says, okay, the other side, the defendant has to take a Shevuot. This is also really interesting about sort of victim centricity, right? The sense of who would make a claim rather than saying, you make a claim, we suspect you. You wouldn't make a claim unless there was something to claim. Something to think about there, right? They still don't rule like the plaintiff, but they at least force the defendant to show that they think they're telling the truth enough that they'd be willing to take a Shevuot, right? So that's kind of the world, generally speaking, the world of Shevuot, right? Seeing all that and knowing all that, I want to go back to our Shevuot in the Mishnah, right? Our Shevuot in the opening Mishnah of Bava Metzia, it doesn't really fit neatly into any of these. It really doesn't. First of all, as we said, like who's the plaintiff and who's the defendant? They're both, right? So it's interesting. We said that Rabbi Yochanan in Bava Metzia Daf Ham Bet said that it's because we don't want to it's like a special Shevuot because we don't want people to just grab things from each other. But it's interesting to note that the Yerushalmi offers a different opinion, and that different opinion looks a lot like Bava Metzia. That something that might be going on here is something akin to Bava Metzia Hatana, which you can already feel a little bit like, yeah, that's interesting because one is saying it's all mine and the other one's saying at least 50 of it is mine. So in some ways, there is like half agreement, even though there is no agreement really. But let's see how the Yerushalmi deals with it. One thing also I should mention about Shevuot Hesed is that unlike Shevuot Hadayanim D'Oraita and unlike Shevuot HaMishnah D'Rabbanan, Shevuot Hesed doesn't use a Sefer Torah or tefillin, right? There's no what we call Nakitat Chayfetz. Okay, so back to the Yerushalmi. So the Yerushalmi says in Tubot Perak Bet Halakha Aleph, right, which is the way that we refer to like mishnayot or sections in the Yerushalmi. And if you look in the Vilna Yerushalmi, which is probably what people would buy in a farm store, I think it's on Daf Tet Amud Bet. And it goes like this. What if you have a situation where te'ano maneh, a plaintiff says, you owe me 100 zuz. V'kafar bo, and the defendant says, I owe you nothing, right? Kofer b'kol, right? So usually we would say, min haTorah, nothing doing, right? Now, Shevuot Hesed, which is created later, we would say you have to take a Shevuot. But here's the case. Tano maneh kafar. You owe me 100. The defendant says, I owe you nothing. But then, look at this. Ve'evi edim shechayav lo 50. The plaintiff brings edim that the defendant owes her 50. Now, is that similar to the defendant being Bava Metzia? Are these parallel situations? The question really is, in Bava Metzia, the defendant admits it themselves, right? And then takes a Shevuot on the rest. Here, the defendant wasn't Moda anything, right? The defendant didn't admit to anything. But the plaintiff did bring edim who proved that the defendant has to owe at least 50, right? Or has to owe 50. So are they parallel? So Rabbi Chia says, I think they are. Nishba al Ashar, right? the defendant has to take a shvuah on the rest of it, on the other 50. Now, I think of this as mod b'miktzat hatana. Now, is it literally saying that this is a shvuah min haTorah? I don't know. But it seems to be modeled after a shvuah min haTorah, right? Like similar to mod b'miktzat, I admit that I owe you 50 and then I take a shvuah on the rest. If you can bring edim that I owe you 50, I'll take a shvuah on the rest, right? Rabbi Yochanan Omer, Eino nishbal shar. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. No. Right? So maybe it's not like mod b'miktzat. It's not the same. And Mishnayim ochzin b'talis lamad Rabbi Chia Rabba. Then the Gemara says, by the way, you know where Rabbi Chia gets his idea that you would take a shvuah on the rest if somebody brought edim that you owed half. He learns it from our first mishnah in Bava Metzia. Did Tanina Taman, because we learned there. Shnayim ochzin b'talis, you have two people who are holding a garment. They each claim that they found it. Okay, you ready? Person A, who is holding half of it, it's similar to the person who brings edim that half of it is theirs, right? Meaning it's similar to the person in the case where the plaintiff says, you owe me 100. The defendant says, I owe you nothing. The plaintiff brings edim that says, you owe me 50. And then the defendant has to pay the 50 and take a shvuah on the rest. Similar here. There's a plaintiff who says, this is all mine. There's a defendant who says, none of this is yours. But the fact that the plaintiff is holding half of it is similar to the plaintiff bringing edim that the defendant owes them half. And then let the defendant take a shvuah on the rest. Right? Pretty brilliant. V'hala Omer, the other guy says, Kula Shali, it's all mine. Right? It's very similar to the 100, 0, and then bring edim on 50. And then the same is true of the other litigant. And the other person who's also holding half, it's as though they're bringing edim, that half of it is theirs, and the other person owes them this half. V'hala Omer, Kula Shali, and the other person says, no, I don't owe you anything, but too bad. The same way when the plaintiff says you owe me 100 and the defendant says I owe you 0, and the plaintiff brings edim that you owe them half, you have to take a shvuah on the rest, right? So really, really interesting. Now, the Gemara then goes on to say, well, obviously he didn't hear Rabbi Yochanan's explanation for what this shvuah is about. Rabbi Yochanan's explanation is that a person should see their friend in the shuk and take their stuff. Fine. But I do think it's interesting, at the very least, to see that Rabbi Chia Rabbah, or the way that the Gemara is explaining Rabbi Chia Rabbah, is he's trying to figure out like a way for this shvuah to fit into some other model of shvuot that we already have, right? And in this case, it's something like a mod b'miktzat, but it's a mod b'miktzat with some edim. Now, if the argument in this Yerushalmi sounds familiar to you, it's because it's also in the Bavli. You learned it on Daf Gimel, right? The conversation of maybe Rabbi Chia's position that mod b'miktzat hatana is not just a case where somebody, the defendant themselves, admit something, but it's where the plaintiff brings edim to prove that miktzat hatana is true, and that may be applicable to the shvuah in Yachloku b'shvuah. That may be what the Yachloku b'shvuah is in our opening mishnah. The reason why I wanted you to see it in the Yerushalmi is twofold. Number one, I love that Rabbi Chia Rabbah and Rabbi Yochanan are back to back in the Yerushalmi, and it shows you something about how much more expanded the Bavli is than the Yerushalmi, right? The Yerushalmi tells this story in a few lines. The Bavli takes 2 dapim, 3 dapim to get to Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, right? You start with Rabbi Chia's opinion that it's mod b'miktzat, And then you get to Rabbi Yochanan's opinion 2 dapim later. But regardless of whether you get it from the Yerushalmi or the Bavli, you get the more narrow version, the sort of the more terse version where Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yochanan are sitting against each other, or you get the more expensive version where on Daf Gimel you have Rabbi Chia that this is Moed b'miktzat, that the Shevuot in the Mishnah is Moed b'miktzat, and you have Rabbi Yochanan on Daf Hey that the Shevuot is a special takana. Regardless, whether you Yerushalmi or the Bavli, what we see is the question of trying to figure out where this Shevuah fits. Does it fit a paradigm that we already have, like Moed b'miktzat, or is it its own takana that's specifically to get people not to steal from each other? But I do hope that by being able to focus on Rabbi Yochanan's opinion on Daf Hey Amud Bet, we sort of pushed ourselves to look at the whole background of Shevuot, where Rabbi Yochanan is essentially saying this doesn't fit in to that background, even as Rabbi Chia had suggested that perhaps it does. Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to learning again soon.